Good morning, BenBinFro, and our thought for today, Tuesday the 17th of August, comes from Mark 5, verses 21 to 34. Jesus raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now, Mark's Gospel is like the highlight tape of Jesus. It's his greatest hits. It's short, fast-paced, and to the point. And our passage today has layers, like a sandwich, 2 stories in one, and you can't break it apart. You need the whole thing to make a meal. Together they teach one biblical mega lesson. And what's that lesson? This, that the most crucial element of our lives is faith. So what is biblical faith? As Martin Luther said, faith is a living, bold trust in God's grace, so certain of God's favour that it would risk death 1,000 times trusting in it. So biblical faith is complete trust in God for your entire life. Biblical faith is not a leap in the dark. It's not hoping something is there on the other side to catch you. Biblical faith is a complete trust in the trustworthy God who is there and who is not silent. We see in the passage how faith took Jairus from a life of fear to peace. We see how faith took the woman from a life of suffering to healing. And right now, every one of us is on a faith journey, on a spectrum ranging from unfaith to faith. And where are we on that spectrum? This passage helps us to determine our place, but it does more than that. It also shows us that the place Jesus wants us to move to. And it does that by showing us 2 movements of faith. First, through circumstances. Life isn't easy. Things happen. Look at Jairus. Mark tells us in verse 22, he was one of the rulers of the synagogue. He was a community leader. Everyone knew him. He was well off. He probably didn't need a lot from others. But then his daughter gets sick. And as time went on, she grew worse and worse until she was at the point of death. As he looks out his window, he sees a crowd. He sees Jesus has come to town. He looks back at his dying 12-year-old daughter and decides to run to Jesus for help. He falls at his feet and says, "My little daughter is at the point of death." It was an urgent plea. Then there is this poor, suffering woman. For 12 years she had suffered a constant flow of blood. It made her ceremonially unclean, preventing her from worshipping in the temple. She's a social outcast, she's at the end of her rope. And as she sits in the street, she sees the crowd coming her way, and the one whom she's heard about is among them. And she thinks, he can help me. In both cases, their circumstances were beyond their control. Both reached a breaking point, both desperate for help beyond what this world could offer them. Their circumstances that crashed on top of them summoned something from within, something that no doubt surprised each of them, something that led them to run towards another, whom they believed had what they needed. Their circumstances summoned a faith that even they probably were previously unaware of. And that's the beginning of biblical faith, simply looking at Jesus as one who can help and coming to Jesus for that help. And often it takes overwhelming circumstances before we're ready to come. That's the first movement of faith, but it's not the last. Circumstances summon faith, but honesty forges faith, which is our second point. After Jairus' plea, Jesus agrees to go with him. They move slowly because the crowds press in around them. Now the suffering woman takes centre stage, but Jairus is racing to his house with Jesus, hoping there's enough time before his daughter passes away. And now, out of the blue, they're being held up by some woman. Imagine the frustration of Jairus. But here she is, weak and out of options, but just strong enough to come, which is all the strength Jesus requires. As she makes her way through the crowd, everyone she touches becomes unclean because of her. Then she reaches out her hand, touches the edge of Jesus' garment, and something happens. Now, lots of people touched Jesus that day, and nothing happened to them. Just being around Jesus isn't enough. Proximity doesn't change things. A lot of people think it does. A lot of people think nearness to Jesus, nearness to church, nearness to other Christians is enough. Like the holiness just rubs off. But it doesn't work that way. Proximity isn't enough. There is a way of touching Jesus without really touching him. There's a way of touching Jesus without receiving his power. So what unlocks his power? Simply this: the personal need of a saviour and the empty hands of faith. That's all this woman had, and that's all she needed. So many in the crowd that day were just excited about what Jesus might do for others. This woman was desperate for what he might do for her. And that's the difference. It's the difference between seeing Jesus as a spectacle and seeing Jesus as their saviour. After her touch, Jesus stops. He has something to say to her. He asks, "Who touched me?" You can imagine the fear welling up inside the woman. She came to Jesus. She touched him. He healed her disease. Isn't that enough? Not for Jesus. Her faith was true faith, but there was a healing this woman had not yet received from Jesus that only confession would bring about. So Jesus looks around, waiting. I wonder how long that wait was. For the woman and for Jairus, it must have felt like eternity. And then she comes. Look at verse 33. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. Why was she scared? Why wouldn't she be? Here she is, an unclean woman, a social outcast, speaking up in front of all these men. Isn't that a fear inside of us all? Don't we all fear what God will do to us in those moments when he's calling us to confession? Will he turn away from me? Will he punish me? But she came. She knew what had happened to her. She knew she was the one who had touched him. And she was ready to own it. And what does she do? In verse 33 we read, she came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. There's a lesson here for us. Jesus is no slot machine God. He is not there to give us what we think we need. He's there to give us what he knows we need. But to give us that, he's going to ask a lot of us. He's going to ask more of us than we planned on sharing. He's going to ask for honesty. So circumstances summon faith, but honesty forges faith. So as we begin our day, I pray we might reflect on the responses in this passage of both Jairus and the suffering woman, and where each of us are on our faith journeys. Have a great day.